The throne room smelled of old blood and something worse, the absence of Rasmus Dragomir. Seraphina Holloway noticed it the moment the guards dragged her through the iron-veined doors of the Obsidian Court, her wrists bruised from the grip of creatures that had not breathed voluntarily in centuries. She had been a healer in the human world for 7 years, stitching wounds both visible and invisible, and she had learned to read the atmosphere of a room the way a surgeon reads vitals. This room was crashing. The Vampire King sat on a throne carved from a single piece of black volcanic stone, and he was magnificent, and he was terrifying, and he was gone. That was the only word for it. The man, the creature, who had ruled the vampire nation for 400 years, sat upright, white-haired and pale as winter marble, dressed in a dark suit that cost more than Seraphina's entire clinic, and his silver eyes stared at a point 3 feet past the back wall, as though he were watching something play out in a country no living being could enter. "Your Majesty," said Lord Vitharius, the Chancellor who had orchestrated Seraphina's abduction with devastating politeness, "the human healer you requested." Nothing. The court shifted. 40 vampires in formal dress, every one of them ancient, every one of them calculating, and every one of them watching their king the way wolves watch a wounded alpha, with loyalty and with hunger, and with the terrible patience of things that would outlive everything. Seraphina pulled her wrist free from the guard, who had finally loosened his grip out of apparent boredom, straightened her coat, and walked forward 3 steps on her own. "Rasmus Dragomir," she said clearly. The silver eyes moved slowly, the way a lighthouse beam moved, not because it was uncertain of its direction, but because its revolution was vast and unhurried. He looked at her, and something in those eyes recognized her. Something buried so deep it had to claw its way up through layers of something she could only describe as fog. "The healer," he said. His voice was low and resonant, the kind of voice that had commanded armies and signed treaties and sentenced traitors, but it was fraying at the edges in a way that made Seraphid's clinical instincts fire like circuit breakers, tripping one after another. "You came." "I was brought," she said. But yes, she had met Rasmus Dragomir exactly once before tonight, 3 months ago, when she had been the on-call physician at an emergency care partnership clinic that served the underground vampire population of the city. A vampire noble had arrived with a wound from a silver-laced blade unusual enough, and Rasmus had accompanied him as an escort, and Seraphina had barely glanced at the tall, pale man in the doorway before the wounded noble had seized her hand, and she had worked for 2 hours to save his life. At the end, she had looked up, blood on her gloves, exhausted and steady, and Rasmus had been watching her with an expression that she had not been able to name then and could not name now. He had said 3 words before he left. You are careful." It had sounded for reasons she could not explain, like the most intimate thing anyone had ever said to her. Now Lord Vetharius stepped forward with a slight bow that was built entirely of knives. "Your Majesty requested a healer of particular skill, one who has treated our kind without fear or agenda. We have honored that request." "You had me kidnapped," Seraphina said pleasantly, still watching the king. "Escorted," Vitharius said. "My car door is still open on the street on Marlowe Avenue," she said. "My coffee is getting cold. That's a kidnapping." Rasmus blinked. It was a small movement, but the entire court seemed to exhale at it, as though blinking were proof of life. "Leave us," Rasmus said. Vitharius went very still. "Your Majesty, blood law requires that a human not be left unattended with." "Leave us," The voice had changed. It was not a fraying thing anymore. It was something ancient and absolute. A sound that had nothing to do with vocal cords, and everything to do with 4 centuries of dominion. Seraphina felt it move through the air like a pressure change before a storm, and she understood in that moment why vampires followed this man. The court emptied in under 30 seconds. Seraphina stood alone in the vast throne room with the vampire king, who was still sitting very correctly on his volcanic stone throne, and she walked closer because she was a healer, and she had never once in her professional life backed away from a patient. "Tell me what's happening," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Up close, he was even more striking. The white hair was not a color but a quality, like light passing through the finest crystal, and the silver eyes had depth to them that had nothing to do with their irises and everything to do with what lived behind them. He was perhaps the most beautiful and frightening person she had ever seen, and she had once performed field surgery in a war zone. "I am losing myself," Rasmus said. She had not expected that. She had expected demands, or tests, or the elaborate political theater that seemed to saturate every interaction in this court like incense. She had not expected the truth. "Losing yourself how?" she asked. He rose from the throne, and even that movement was regal, unhurried, the stand of a man who has never had to rush because the world has always waited for him. He walked to the tall window. Blacked out, she noticed, not curtained, but treated with something that turned the glass opaque, and he stood with his hands loosely clasped behind his back. "There is a condition," he said, "among our kind. It has no name in your language. We call it the grey dissolution. It is what happens when a vampire of significant age loses the anchor of their identity." He paused. "It begins with forgetting, not facts, not history, but self. Who one was before the centuries accumulated, what one chose, what one refused, why." Another pause, longer. "It ends in madness, and then in nothing." Seraphina was quiet for a moment, then she said, "How long have you been experiencing this?" 6 months. Who knows if there are suspects? My generals do not. My people cannot know. Why me? She asked. Specifically, you could have any healer, any doctor, any 'cause you treated Aldrich without flinching, Rasmus said quietly. And when you were done, you looked up and you were completely yourself. Not afraid, not awed, not performing. You were exactly who you were when you walked in, and I thought, he stopped. You thought what? He turned from the window. I thought that someone who knew so precisely who they were might be able to help someone who did not. Seraphina absorbed this. 7 years of clinical practice had taught her to hear what patients said under the words they were actually saying, and what Rasmus Dragomir was saying under everything was, I am terrified, and I do not know how to be terrified, and I have been carrying this alone for 6 months, and I chose you because you were the only person I could imagine trusting with it. She had no idea what to do with that. Clinically, she had plenty of thoughts. Personally, she had several more that she set firmly aside. All right, she said. I need to understand the condition better before I can tell you what I can offer. I'm a healer, not a vampire specialist. I work with your kind, but I don't know your physiology the way I know human physiology. I know, he said. That is also part of why I chose you. A vampire specialist would report to the court, a human healer who has spent 7 years treating our kind privately, quietly, with discretion. He looked at her steadily. You are not embedded in this world's politics. I am now, she said dryly. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it had the shape of one. Yes, he said. I am sorry for that. You could have asked, you would have said no. Probably, she admitted. But the asking would have mattered. She met his eyes. That will be the first thing I require of you if we're going to work together. You ask. Whatever this arrangement is going to be, you ask me, not your court, not Vitharius. You, the silver eyes held hers. And she felt again that sense of something vast and ancient, fixing its full attention on her, which was both more than she had bargained for, and somehow not as frightening as it should have been. Agreed, he said. She nodded. Then show me where I'm going to work. What followed was 2 weeks of the strangest professional engagement of Seraphina Holloway's entire career. Rasmus gave her a suite of rooms in the Obsidian Court, which turned out to be a converted 19th century Gothic revival mansion in the heart of the city, hidden from human awareness through a combination of deliberate obscurity and a property boundary, spelled to encourage passers-by to look elsewhere, and she requested her equipment from clinic through a system of very uncomfortable intermediaries who were polite in the way that loaded weapons were polite. She worked. She read everything she could find about vampire physiology, cross-referencing it with human neurology, with identity disorders, with dissociation, with the academic papers written by the small network of medical professionals who served the vampire population and carefully did not publish their findings anywhere that mattered. She requested meetings with Rasmus every morning and evening, 40 minutes each, during which she asked him questions that no one in his court had ever asked him. What was the first thing you remember choosing for yourself rather than having it chosen for you? When I was 31, human still, I chose to leave my father's estate in Moldova and travel east because I had a need to see the CC that I could not explain and could not resist. He called it foolishness. It was the best decision I ever made. A fractional pause. It was where I encountered the one who turned me. I have never decided whether that makes the choice the best or worst of my life. Both, probably, Seraphina said, writing. What did the sea look like? He was quiet. Then he said, Blue, a blue I have not found a name for in 400 years. Like the inside of a thought before it becomes words. She wrote that down too. What do you believe in? Not politically. Personally, longer pause this time. I believe that power without restraint is its own punishment. I have seen what I could become with no law governing me, and I built the blood law specifically to prevent that version of myself from ever existing. Tell me about the blood law. It governs all transactions between our kind and humans. No human may be taken without agreement. No human may be harmed for sustenance. No ancient debt of blood may be collected without the indebted party's descendant being given the right of refusal. He stopped, and something in his face shifted, a real expression breaking through the careful control, something that looked startlingly like passion. It is the thing I am most proud of in 4 centuries, more than any war won, more than any court built. That law exists because I decided it should, against the opposition of every elder in my nation, and it has held for 200 years. Seraphina looked up from her notes. Why did you never tell me that was the thing you were most proud of? You never asked, he said. I'm asking everything, she said. Yes. He looked at her with that careful, measuring look she was beginning to know. I am not practiced at this. At being asked, I know, she said. Not unkindly. That's why it's working. Because it was working. She could see it in gradations so small that she doubted anyone else in the court had noticed, but she noticed everything. The 1,000-yard stare happened less frequently, and when it did, it lasted for shorter durations. He moved through his court with more deliberateness. His voice had stopped fraying at the edges. He had begun, over the course of 2 weeks, to tell her things that she suspected he had not said aloud in a century or more, and each time he did, he looked marginally more present in his own body. She was careful. She was professional. She was doing her job. She was also, which she noted, with the same clinical detachment she applied to everything, beginning to want to cross a line she had drawn very firmly for herself on the first day. It was the conversations. She had not expected the conversations. She had expected difficulty, guardedness, the elaborate emotional armor of a man who had been a king for 4 centuries. What she had not expected was the wit, dry and dark and occasionally startling. She had not expected the questions he asked her in return, not as a courtesy, she realized, but because he was genuinely curious about her in a way that was both flattering and slightly unnerving. She had not expected to find herself at 9 in the evening, sitting across a fireplace from the most powerful vampire in the known world, arguing about the ethics of immortality with a glass of water in her hand, and the feeling that she had been in this conversation her entire life, and was only now recognizing it. "You could not possibly understand the weight of it," he said one evening, not unkindly, but with the certainty of someone stating the color of the sky. "I understand that it sounds like a convenient excuse," she replied. He blinked. "I beg your pardon. The weight of immortality as a justification for isolation. I've heard versions of it from vampires who have lived 20 years and vampires who have lived 600. It's always the same structural argument. The suffering is unique. The duration is incomprehensible. No one else could possibly understand. And it always ends the same way, alone, and convinced the aloneness is inevitable rather than chosen." Rasmus looked at her with an expression that was new. She had catalogued dozens of his expressions over 2 weeks, filed them neatly in the part of her brain that was still pretending this was entirely professional. This one she had not seen before. It was somewhere between being challenged and being seen, and it seemed to cost him something significant. "You are remarkably blunt," he said. "You hired a healer," she said. "Healers have to be." "I requested you," he said. "There is a difference." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the city moved in its familiar patterns, unaware that below a treated Gothic mansion in its most expensive district, a vampire king was in the process of finding his way back to himself, guided by a human woman who would have, 3 weeks ago, called this entire scenario clinically improbable. "Yes," she said, "there is." She did not examine the warmth that sat in that difference. She was too professional for that. For approximately 4 more days, the crisis came on a Tuesday, which seemed inappropriately mundane for something that nearly ended everything. Seraphina was in her workroom at 2:30 in the morning. She had long since adjusted her schedule to the court's rhythms, when the door opened without a knock, and Rasmus entered with blood on his shirt and a look on his face that she had been dreading since the first day she understood the nature of his condition. He was not present, not in the way that frightened her, the drifting absence she had been carefully walking him back from. This was something sharper and worse, a disassociation with an edge to it, as though the part of him that was 4 centuries of memories and accumulated power had detached and was watching the part of him that was a 31-year-old man from Moldova who had once gone to see the sea, and neither part was in charge. "Rasmus," she said, and was on her feet and, across the room, in the time it took most people to register movement. He turned. The silver eyes were flat in a way that made her stomach drop. "Something has happened," he said, and his voice was 2 registers too low, the ancient authority overwhelming. "I can see that," she said. "Tell me." "Vetharius," he said, "has moved against the blood law. He has been negotiating with the elder faction to have it repealed. He presented the motion to the inner council tonight." Seraphina felt cold. She understood enough of vampire politics now to know that the blood law was not merely legislation. It was the primary protection for every human in the city who existed in the vicinity of the vampire population, which was to say, everyone. Its repeal would not happen overnight, but its motion was a signal, and signals had consequences. It was also, she understood more personally and immediately, a direct attack on the thing Rasmus had told her he was most proud of, on the core of who he was. "How did the council vote?" she asked. "It has not voted yet. The motion stands open for 3 nights. His jaw was set. "I have the authority to dismiss it by royal decree. I have always had that authority, and He stopped. The flat look intensified. She stepped closer. "Rasmus, I could not remember," he said very quietly, "why I built it." The room was very still. "In the council chamber," he said. Vetharius laid out his arguments. They were not stupid. They addressed the economic constraints, the logistical complications, the ancient compact rights that the law overrides. And I sat there, and I listened, and he exhaled, a sound that had nothing to do with breathing and everything to do with something cracking. I could not find the reason in myself, the feeling that made me fight for it for 40 years against everyone who told me it was weakness. I knew I had built it. I knew the arguments for it. But he pressed 2 fingers to his chest, directly over his sternum. The part of me that knew it was right, I could not find it. Seraphina made a decision. She reached up and put her hand over his, where it pressed against his chest. He went absolutely still. "Listen to me," she said. "You told me about the blood law 7 days ago. You told me you built it because you had seen what power without restraint turned into, and you refused to be that. You told me it was the thing you were most proud of, not a conquest, not a dynasty, a law that protected people who could not protect themselves." She pressed his hand more firmly. "That is not a political position. That is who you are. That is the thread." He was looking down at her with an expression that did something to her professional detachment that she would address later when there was time. "That is the thread," she said again. "Hold on to it." A long silence. The clock on the wall, an old brass thing that seemed to belong to another century, which given the decor was possibly literally true, ticked through 7 or 8 of the slowest seconds of Seraphina's life. Then the silver eyes changed. The flatness broke, not dramatically, not in the cinematic way that would make for a good story, but in the way that mattered, slowly, privately, like light returning to a room through a crack under a door rather than through a broken window. "Yes," he said softly. "Yes." He covered her hand with his other hand, both of his hands over hers, warm for something that was supposed to be cold. She had noted early on that Rasmus ran warmer than the court average, another thing the vampirology texts had not prepared her for. "Seraphina," he said. "Yes," she said somewhat breathlessly, which she would also address later. "I am going to go back to the council chamber," he said, "and I am going to dismiss the motion with a royal decree. And then I am going to have a very significant conversation with Vetharius about the nature of loyalty." "That sounds wise," she said. "Will you—" He stopped. She could see him ask, the way she had told him to do from the beginning, ask, genuinely ask, wait in the question, not command. "Will you wait for me?" "Yes," she said. He nodded once, straightened his jacket, with the automatic precision of a man who has performed the gesture 10,000 times, looked at her for one more moment, with something in his face, that she had stopped pretending she did not understand. Then he walked out of the room with 400 years of authority, and one reclaimed thread of himself, and the blood law was safe by morning. The conversation with Vitharius was, by all accounts, quiet. This was, Seraphina gathered from the shell-shocked expressions of the court vampires who drifted past her workroom door over the following days, significantly more frightening than if it had been loud. Vitharius remained chancellor, which surprised her until Rasmus explained it with the calm pragmatism of someone who had been playing long games since before her country existed. "He is more dangerous dismissed than in place," Rasmus said. "A snake you have named and located is less of a threat than one you have driven into the grass. I have made the boundaries clear. He will not move again, and if he does," she asked, "then the consequences will be significant," Rasmus said simply, and she believed him in the same way she believed in weather and gravity. What she had not anticipated was what came after. After the crisis, after the decree, after the slow and documented improvement that she had spent 3 weeks carefully tracking in her notes. She had done her job. The grey dissolution was not gone. She did not believe it could be gone in 3 weeks, or possibly ever entirely, but it was managed, and the management was something that Rasmus now understood and could practice. She had explained carefully, essentially been losing the anchors of his personal identity to the accumulated weight of institutional identity, the king consuming the man, and the treatment was not medication or surgery, but the deliberate, regular practice of remembering who the man had chosen to be before he became what everyone else needed him to be. This was, clinically speaking, a perfectly coherent treatment protocol with a reasonable prognosis. It was also, she had to acknowledge to herself, one quiet morning while reviewing her notes, something she had become entirely too invested in, not clinically, personally. She was sitting with this acknowledgement, which had the discomfort of all honest acknowledgements, when Rasmus appeared in her workroom doorway at an unusual hour mid-morning, which, for the court, was the equivalent of 3 in the morning for humans, the quietest and most private part of the day. He was not in formal dress. This was notable. In the 5 weeks she had been in the Obsidian Court, she had never seen Rasmus in anything other than the precise, expensive formality that his position seemed to generate automatically. Now he was in dark trousers and a simple shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearms, and he had a book under his arm and looked marginally more like a person's. He looked, she thought, quite dangerously good. "May I sit?" he asked. She was inordinately pleased by the asking. "Yes," she said. He sat across from her. They had established a comfortable geography of workroom chairs over 5 weeks, each gravitating without comment to the same seat every session, and set the book on the small table between them. It was old, the binding cracked and clearly repaired multiple times, the spine in Cyrillic. "This is the book my mother gave me when I was 17, he said. "I carried it with me when I left Moldova. I have carried it for 400 years. Seraphina looked at it, then at him. "It is the reason I learned to value what endures," he said. "She told me that a man could lose everything. His land, his money, his health, his people, and if he knew who he was, he had not lost anything that mattered." He paused. "I had forgotten this book existed. You asked me yesterday to name the things I had chosen to keep across 4 centuries. Not the things I had accumulated, but the things I had deliberately carried. And last night I went looking." She understood what he was telling her, not just the content, the thread. He had found another thread on his own because she had asked the right question. "How does that feel?" she asked, and there was nothing clinical in the question at all. He considered it, and the consideration was the kind that took time because it was genuine. "Like being handed something I had been carrying so long that I stopped knowing it was in my hands," he said finally, and looking at it properly for the first time, she nodded. "Seraphina," he said. "Yes," she said, which was becoming, she noticed, her default response to her own name in his voice. "I have been considering a question," he said, "and I am going to ask it because you told me to ask, and because I find that I have developed the habit." She waited. "What will you do?" he said carefully. "When your work here is finished." She had thought about this. She had thought about it with the clinical side of her brain, which produced a clear and reasonable answer about returning to her clinic, resuming her patient load, writing up the grey dissolution case for the discrete medical network, and continuing her career as she had built it. She had also thought about it with the part of her brain that she had been firmly telling to be quiet for 5 weeks, which produced an entirely different answer that she had not yet been brave enough to examine properly. "I'll go back to the clinic," she said. "My work here will have a natural conclusion point. The acute phase of the dissolution is resolved. I'll leave you with a protocol for maintenance." "Is that what you want?" he asked. She stopped. The question was quiet and genuine, and it landed with precision because she had, over 5 weeks, watched him ask questions the same way he had learned to ask for things, with the full weight of a man who genuinely wanted the answer. "That's not really the relevant variable," she said carefully. "I disagree," he said. "I find it highly relevant." She looked at him. He looked back. The morning light from the treated windows turned to a dim amber glow, safe for whatever light sensitivity he maintained even in this enhanced form, made him look like a painting of himself, all white and silver and dark cloth, and she thought again that he was absurdly beautiful, and found that she had stopped being as careful about thinking that as she had been in the first few weeks. "Rasmus," she said. "Yes," he said, echoing her own cadences back to her, and she saw the corner of his mouth move. "I am your physician," she said. "There are professional considerations. You have been more than my physician for some time now," he said, "and I believe we both know it." She had nothing to say to this because it was entirely true. "I am not asking you to make any declaration," he said. "I am asking what you want, because you are the person who taught me that what I want has not been asked often enough, and I suspect the same is true of you." She thought about her clinic on Marlowe Avenue, and her apartment 3 blocks away, and the coffee that had gone cold on the day they took her, and she thought about 5 weeks of conversations that had felt more real than most of the conversations of her adult life. And she thought about a vampire king who had been losing himself and had trusted her with the most private, most frightening thing he carried. "I don't want to leave," she said, not as a declaration, as the truth, which was what he had asked for. Something in his face did a complicated thing that resolved into stillness. "Then don't," he said. "That's not a sentence," she said. "That's not a plan. There are the court and Vitharius and the blood law politics, and the fact that I'm human and you're. I am aware of what I am," he said, with a trace of something that was not quite amusement, but was its close neighbor. "I have been aware for 4 centuries. My lifespan," she said, because she was a healer and she had to name the obvious things. "Your lifespan, these are not compatible." He was quiet for a moment. There are options, he said carefully, that our kind has explored with appropriate consent that can extend in various ways. I am not suggesting anything now. I am suggesting that the obvious obstacle is not insurmountable, and that I would like, if you are willing, the time to explore what this is before we determine whether it is possible. She absorbed this. She was a healer. She had heard the medical realities of human vampire life extension discussed in the clinical literature, always in careful, abstract terms, always noting that it required the human's full informed consent and posed its own complexities and questions. She had never thought about it in relation to herself. She was thinking about it now. "You are asking me," she said. "Yes." "All right," she said. She watched something tightly held in him release. It was quiet, invisible to anyone who had not spent 5 weeks cataloguing the precise landscape of his expressions, but she saw it clearly. "Then I will ask again tomorrow," he said, "and the day after, for as long as it takes." She smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that happened before she had a chance to arrange her face into something more professional, and she saw his eyes fix on it with an intensity that made her feel warm from the inside out. "That's rather a long time," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Fortunately, I have it." The weeks that followed were different. Not dramatically different. The court did not suddenly become friendly. The politics did not simplify. The grey dissolution did not vanish. But something between them had been named. Quietly and without ceremony. And the naming of a thing changes the way you carry it. They had dinner together. Not a formal court dinner, but dinner in the private rooms that Rasmus apparently retreated to when the court's ceremonial weight became too much. Smaller rooms, warmer, filled with the accumulated evidence of 4 centuries of genuine rather than curated taste. Books from 3 countries and 7 languages. Maps, instruments she did not recognize. A collection of stones from places he had been. She asked about each stone. He told her. She listened in the way that healers listen, completely, without building her response while he was still speaking. And he talked the way a man talks who has been heard properly, perhaps for the first time in a very long time. He learned her too. He was meticulous about it. The same methodical attention he brought to everything he valued, and she found herself telling him things she had not planned to say, about her mother, who had been a nurse, who had taught her that caring for people was not a soft thing, but a fierce one, about the war zone she had worked in at 26, which had broken something in her and rebuilt it denser and more purposeful, about the 7 years of her clinic and the patients she remembered most, and the particular professional loneliness of being very good at a job that most people found either frightening or incomprehensible. "You built something too," he said one evening, after she had described the clinic's early days, the first vampire patient she had treated, the years of quiet establishment of trust between her practice and the underground community, in the way that I built the blood law, something that did not exist before you decided it should. She had not thought of it that way. "It's just a clinic," she said. "The blood law is just a law," he said, with a simplicity that settled the matter entirely. There was a night in the 7th week when the court crisis came back in a different form, because courts always find new forms for the same crisis. One of the elder faction, a vampire named Corvinus, who had been in disagreement with Rasmus for approximately 300 years on the basis of political philosophy and possibly personal style, brought a challenge through the ancient compact, a formal declaration of contested authority over one specific territory dispute that required under Old World Vampire Code. A resolution by direct confrontation. This was not, Seraphina gathered from the way the court went rigid and quiet when the declaration was delivered, a duel. It was something older and more complicated, a process of contested memory and declared truth before the full court, where each party had to stand before the assembly and speak their governing truth, and the court would determine, through some combination of political reality and genuine conviction, which she was not sure she fully understood, which truth held. It was also, she understood immediately and with a lurch of genuine fear, exactly the kind of confrontation that was most dangerous for someone in the early stages of recovering from the grey dissolution. Rasmus came to her workroom that night with the declaration in his hand and the careful set to his jaw that meant he was already preparing, already reaching for the institutional armor, the king instead of the man, and she put her hand on the paper and said, "Stop." He stopped. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "You cannot walk into that chamber as the king," she said. "You will lose. Not because you're wrong about the territory, but because the king has 4 centuries of institutional weight. And Corvanthus will use that weight against you. He will argue precedent. He will argue the machinery of power, and if you fight him on those terms, you're fighting on ground he's prepared." Rasmus looked at her steadily. "What ground do you suggest?" "You walk in as yourself," she said, "the man who built the blood law because it was right, who refused to become what power would have made him, who has governed for 400 years, not because he inherited the right, but because he keeps choosing it." She leaned forward. The court does not need to validate the king. They need to choose whether they follow the man, make them choose the man. A long silence ends. "You understand our politics," he said, "better than most of my advisors." "I understand people," she said. "The politics are just people at scale." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that she had learned to recognize over 7 weeks, not the silver flatness of the dissolution, not the controlled authority of the public face, but the private, direct, completely personal gaze of Rasmus Dragomir the man, which was both more dangerous and more wonderful than anything else about him. "Come with me," he said. She blinked. "Into the court challenge? You are my physician. You have the right to attend any proceeding that might affect the health of the king." He paused. "That is the official reason. The personal reason is that I would like you there." "You're asking," she said softly. "Yes," he said. "I am asking." She went. The full court was assembled in the great hall, which was different from the throne room, longer, lower ceilinged, lit by 1,000 candles that were absolutely not electric, and filled the air with moving gold light and the smell of beeswax. Every vampire in the Obsidian Court was present. Seraphina stood at the edge of the chamber beside Rasmus's second, a vampire named Thessaly, who had treated Seraphina with cautious respect since the night the blood law motion was dismissed, and had apparently concluded she was someone worth being careful about. Corvanthus was tall and very old, white-haired as they all were, but with the quality of age that even vampires showed eventually, not in lines or changes of the body, but in a certain crystallized quality to the stillness, like amber. He presented his case with the precise elegance of someone who had been preparing this argument for a century, and it was good. She would grant him that. Rasmus listened without expression. When Corvanthus finished, Rasmus stood. He did not speak about the territory. He did not speak about precedent or compact rights or the administrative history of the disputed boundary. He spoke about a choice, about a moment 230 years ago when he had stood in a chamber much like this one and decided what kind of king, what kind of man he intended to be. He described it with a specificity and personal weight that was startling from a man she had watched spend 7 weeks remembering how to be specific and personal, and she understood as she watched the room that this was the treatment made visible, not performed. Actual, the court was very still. Corvanthus, when Rasmus finished, was quiet for a longer moment than the formalities required. "The king has spoken truly," he said finally, and the formal weight of the words meant something in the old world code that Seraphina did not entirely understand, but clearly everyone else did. The challenge was resolved. The territory remained under Rasmus's administration. Corvanthus inclined his head once, stiffly, with the expression of a man who has lost the battle and knows it, and will not pretend otherwise. Afterward, in the corridor outside the great hall, Rasmus found her immediately, crossed the space between them, with the directness he was learning to apply to personal things as well as political ones, and for a moment they stood very close, and the 1,000 candles of the hall were still visible through the open doors behind him, and he looked at her the way he had been looking at her for weeks, the look that she had stopped trying to interpret professionally. "Thank you," he said. "You did that yourself," she said. "I just reminded you that you could." "That is not a small thing," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." His hand came up and curved around her jaw, a touch so deliberate and so careful that it could only have been a question, and she answered it by turning her face slightly into his hand, which was answer enough, and he kissed her with the same thoroughness and complete attention that he brought to every other thing that mattered to him, which was to say, entirely and without reservation. It tasted like 400 years deciding to begin again. The court noticed, of course. Courts always noticed. The way they handled it was more interesting. There was a period of approximately 2 days, during which the Obsidian Court made a collective and visible decision about whether to be outraged, calculating, or simply resigned to the fact that the king had apparently made a choice, and that choices made by Rasmus Dragomir with this degree of conviction were not generally revisited. They settled on resigned, which shaded gradually over the following weeks into something closer to acceptance, which was more than she had realistically expected, and more than Rasmus had told her to hope for. Vetharius was, predictably, the most complicated. He came to her workroom on the 11th day after the court challenge alone, without announcement, which was either extremely rude or a gesture of genuine private communication, and she was still deciding which when he sat down across from her, with the expression of a man who has done a great deal of internal intoning and arrived at number he did not particularly like. "You have stabilized him," Vetharius said. "He has stabilized himself," she said, "because this was true and important. With your assistance." Vetharius looked at her with eyes that were very old and very sharp, and were currently doing the kind of assessment that made her think of X-ray machines. "I moved against the blood law," he said, "because I believed he was no longer capable of defending it." "You were wrong," she said. "Yes," he said, without embarrassment. "I was. I do not, as a general rule, apologize for political moves that were based on accurate intelligence at the time. The intelligence changed." He paused. "I am telling you this because you should understand that my opposition was not personal, and my adjustment of position is not personal either. He is a better king stable than diminished. What stabilizes him is, politically speaking, worth protecting." "I'm going to choose to take that as a compliment," Seraphina said. It was intended as one, Vetharius said, which was the most Vetharius thing he had ever said. He stood to leave, and at the door he paused. The blood law, he said, without turning. He built it in 40 years of argument. It is the strongest piece of legislation in our history, and the most contested. If you understand why it matters to him, I do, she said. Then you understand him, he said, and left. She thought about that for a long time. The grey dissolution did not disappear. She had been honest with Rasmus about this from the beginning. It was a condition of age and the particular weight of immortality, and management was the realistic goal, not cure. What she had given him over 10 weeks of careful, structured, often unexpectedly intimate work was a set of anchors, the book from Moldova, the memory of the sea that was blue like the inside of a thought, the blood law and the 40 years of argument it had cost him, the stones on the shelf, each with a story, the practice of asking and of being asked, and herself. She did not say this out loud yet, but it was true, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it had its own warmth that she carried through the days like a coal in winter. They had the conversation about life extension on a night in the 3rd month, sitting in his private rooms with the stones from the shelf between them, because she had asked him to tell her about each one, and they were halfway through, and she wanted to finish before anything else. It was not a planned conversation. It began, as the best conversations between them began, in the middle of something else. He was telling her about a stone from a river in Hungary, small, grey, perfectly smooth, when he said, "I have been thinking about what I said to you early on, about options." She was quiet, listening. "I want to be precise with you," he said, "about what I mean and what I don't mean. I do not want to suggest anything that comes from." He paused, choosing words with the careful attention of someone who has learned that words have specific weights, from a desire to possess rather than to protect. "Say what you mean, Rasmus." "I mean," he said, "that I want you to live a long life, and I would like to be part of it. And if there comes a time when you want to discuss what that might look like in practical terms, I will tell you everything I know about every option available to you, with complete honesty about the risks and the realities, and then I will wait for your decision, because it is entirely and only yours to make." He met her eyes. "That is all." She absorbed this, the way she absorbed important things completely, without rushing the processing. "That is a great deal," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "and I mean every part of it." "I know," she said. "I know you do." She picked up the Hungarian river stone and turned it in her fingers. It was very smooth, the way time made things smooth. "I'm not ready to make that decision," she said. "But I'm not afraid of it either." She set the stone down. "I'd like to finish the story about the river first." His expression did the thing she loved, the not-quite smile that was warmer than a full smile because it was less performed. And he picked up the stone and finished the story. There was one more crisis before the year turned, and it was the worst of them. And she was at the center of it, a faction of the elder court, not Corvanthis's people, but an older and less principled group. 3 vampires whose names Rasmus had spoken with careful neutrality, that she now recognized as the kind of neutrality that contained something much harder, moved against her directly. Not against Rasmus, against her. The logic was, in the brutal way of old-world politics, comprehensible. She was the source of his stability, and his stability had ended their best window for a shift in power. And she was human, and she was therefore the softer target. They took her on a Wednesday evening when she was walking from the clinic to the court, a route that had become routine. which in hindsight she recognized as the tactical vulnerability they had exploited. She had a guard. Rasmus had been giving her a guard for 3 months, which she had found alternately reassuring and faintly irritating. And the guard was good, but there were 3 of them, and they were old, and the street emptied very fast. She was not afraid in the way that made you freeze. She was afraid in the way that made you very precise and very clear-headed, which was the kind of fear her profession had trained her for. The fear that sharpened rather than paralyzed. They brought her to a building she did not recognize, underground, and she catalogued everything she could about it. The number of stairs, the direction of turns, the quality of the air, the sounds from above, because information was always useful. The 3 elder vampires were named Serevos, Malakis, and Drathen. She learned because they spoke to each other in front of her, with the casual contempt of people who do not consider their captive a significant factor in their planning, which she noted as a mistake they were making. "The king will come," said Serevos, who was the eldest and the most clearly the architect of this, with the kind of bone-deep certainty that told her this was the point. She was not a prize, she was bait. She took a breath. She thought about Rasmus, who would come because she knew him, who would be furious because she knew him, who would come alone if he could, because that was the danger of people who were accustomed to being the most formidable presence in any room. She thought about what she had to do. "Can I speak?" she asked Serevos. He looked at her with the particular condescension of something very old toward something very short-lived. "You may." "You're using me as leverage," she said, "because you believe the king's attachment to me is a vulnerability. You believe that his judgment will be compromised by his concern for my safety, and that you can use that compromised judgment to force a concession, probably regarding the succession compact or the blood law or both." Serevos looked mildly surprised. "What you haven't considered," she said, "is that the king's recovery from the grey dissolution has been about the restoration of his judgment, not the compromise of it. The thing you're planning to exploit is the thing that has made him more stable, not less. If you use me to try to destabilize him, you are going to find that you have misjudged the nature of his attachment and the nature of the man." Drathen leaned forward with interest that was not kind. "And what is the nature of his attachment, human? He cares about me," she said calmly, "but he will not sacrifice what he has built for me, and I would not want him to." She met Drathen's eyes without flinching. "What I am telling you is that your plan will not work, and you should consider whether there is an exit from it that does not require you to follow through on whatever you intend to do with me when he refuses your terms." A silence. "You are remarkably composed for someone in your position," Malakis said. "I'm a healer," she said. "I have been in difficult positions before." She meant it as a steadying statement, a professional anchor. But what she felt underneath the precision and the clear-headedness was the same thing she had been feeling for 3 months, which was that she was not going to let whatever happened here undo what she and Rasmus had built, because what they had built was real and hard and worth protecting. She did not have long to wait. When Rasmus came, he did not come alone. A choice she recognized as the reclaimed judgment she had been arguing for. And he did not come angry, which surprised Serevos visibly. He came cold and clear and absolutely certain, with Thessaly and 4 court guard at his back, and he spoke to the 3 elder vampires the way he had spoken in the court challenge, not from the institutional throne, but from the irreducible center of himself. The ultimatum was simple and complete and impossible to argue with, and it was enforced by the entirety of the blood law, which made what they had done subject to immediate judgment. And the three elder vampires were, as Rasmus later described it, with magnificent understatement, significantly disadvantaged by having no viable position left. When it was over, when she was standing in the street outside with the night air on her face and Rasmus directly in front of her with his hands on her shoulders, in the contained and careful way that told her he had been more frightened than he had shown in that room, she said, "I told them it wouldn't work." "I know," Thessaly heard. She was very impressed. A pause. "I was less calm about it." "I know," she said. "I could tell." His hands tightened marginally on her shoulders. "You are not frightened?" "I was," she said. "I was frightened that you'd come alone. I was frightened you'd make a concession you couldn't take back." "I wouldn't have," he said. "I know that too," she said. "I know you." "Yes," he said quietly. "You do." She put her hand against his face. The same gesture she had first made in the throne room when he had come to her with blood on his shirt and the dissolution in his eyes. And this time it was not clinical and it was not therapeutic. It was simply true. "Take me home," she said. He did. The three elder vampires faced compact tribunal, which was the vampire equivalent of something between a criminal court and a political censure, and the outcome was not lenient. The blood law provisions they had violated were specific, and the evidence was complete. Rasmus presided with the kind of balanced authority that she had come to understand was his particular excellence. Not mercy for the sake of appearance, and not severity for the sake of power, but justice in the precise weight the situation actually required. Afterward, he was quiet for 2 days in the way that she recognized, not the dissolution, but the aftermath of something difficult. She gave him space and proximity in the combination she had learned to calibrate over months, sitting in the same room without demanding conversation, available without hovering. On the second evening, he said, "I want you to know what I felt when I understood you were gone." She looked up from the medical journal she was reading. "I have not been frightened," he said, "in a very long time. There is a kind of—" He paused. "The dissolution frightened me, but that was abstract. This was you, specifically, acutely." He looked at her with the direct private gaze that was only ever for her. "I want you to know that I am aware of what that means, and I am not made smaller by it. I am simply," he chose the word carefully, "honest about it." "I know," she said, which was what she said when he said things that were too important for more words. "Good," he said. They sat together in the warm room, and outside the city moved through its night rhythms, and the Obsidian Court was quiet around them, and she thought about the first night she had stood in the throne room and said his name to make his eyes move, and how much had been built in the space between that moment and this one. The year turned. A new one began in the spring of the new year, spring being a relative concept for a court that lived primarily below street level, but marked by a distinct change in the quality of light that reached even the treated windows, and by the city sounds that shifted with the season. Seraphina moved her clinic, not away. She moved it closer, which was a distinction that mattered significantly, and that the underground medical community recognized with a collective response somewhere between relief and mild amazement. The new clinic was in a building adjacent to the Obsidian Court's property boundary, and it was larger, and it was properly equipped, and it served both the vampire community and the human community in that part of the city with the same careful, quiet competence that had always been her practice's signature. Rasmus helped her establish it, not financially, though he offered, with the particular brand of matter-of-fact generosity that she had come to understand was how he expressed care for things he could not fix with himself, but practically in the way that mattered, which was that the Obsidian Court formally endorsed it, and endorsement from the Vampire King was the equivalent of a 200-year security guarantee in the underground community. The morning the clinic opened, properly opened, with its new sign and its expanded space and a waiting room that already had 3 patients in it when she unlocked the door, she found Rasmus waiting outside. This was unusual because he generally did not visit during daylight hours, even in his enhanced form, which gave him significantly more flexibility than the average vampire, out of a combination of genuine light sensitivity and the kind of caution that 4 centuries had made second nature. He was wearing a coat with a high collar and had the particular precise quality of someone who has made a calculation about a risk and decided it was acceptable. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I wanted to," he said. "There is a difference." She looked at him for a moment in the morning light, which reached him in the filtered, indirect way of a street on the shadow side, and she thought about how completely she knew this person, his politics and his history, and his 400-year accumulated catalogue of choices and refusals, his mother's book in Cyrillic, the stones from the shelf, the thread she'd had held for him when he could not hold it himself. "Come inside," she said. "I'll show you where everything is." He followed her into her clinic, into the space she had built, as he had said, the same way he had built the blood law, because she decided it should exist, and she showed him everything, the examination rooms, the supply cabinets, the small library of clinical texts, the waiting room that was already filling, the desk where she would spend the next years of her life doing the work she had chosen. He looked at all of it with the attention he gave to things he valued, which was total and unhurried, and then he looked at her. "You built something extraordinary," he said. "We both have, I think," she said. He understood what she meant. "The clinical work, yes, but also the other thing, the harder and stranger and more remarkable thing, built over a year in a Gothic mansion below a city, in conversations and crises and shared evenings, and the gradual, deliberate work of knowing someone past the layers they showed the world. Yes," he said, "we have." He kissed her in her new clinic, which was not the most professional location she could have chosen, but she had decided some months ago that the professional considerations were no longer the primary organizing principle of her relationship with Rasmus Dragomir, and this decision continued to seem correct. There was a conversation about the future that they had not yet had completely. The long version, the practical version, with all its complex and medical and personal dimensions, and they would have it. She had not forgotten that it needed to happen, and neither had he, and the fact that neither of them was forcing it, that they were letting the time accumulate, and the trust accumulate, and the certainty accumulate, felt correct in the same way that good clinical judgment felt correct. Not rushed, not avoided, but appropriately timed. She would choose, when she chose, with full information and no pressure, and the complete understanding of what she was choosing. He had said as much, and meant it, and showed it, which was what mattered. In the meantime, there was the clinic, and the court, and the blood law that still held and would continue to hold, and the management of the grey dissolution, which was no longer a crisis but a practice. The regular anchoring, the deliberate remembering, the conversations that had begun as treatment and become simply the texture of their life dagger. There was the book from Moldova on the shelf in his private rooms. There were the stones, and she knew every one of their stories now, and he knew hers. There was a healer from Marlow Avenue who had walked into a vampire court at 3 a.m, not knowing who she was about to meet, and a vampire king who had been losing himself thread by thread for 6 months and had made the most significant choice of his long life when he looked at an exhausted physician pulling off bloody gloves and thought, she knows exactly who she is. The thread, she had held it. He had found his way back to it, and somewhere in the holding and the finding, it had become something neither of them had planned for, and both of them had chosen, bright and strong and twined between them, belonging to them both. Not a thing she kept for him anymore, but a thing they kept together. She was particular about her patience, always had been. She treated what was in front of her without flinching, without agenda, without performance. She was exactly who she was when she walked in. He had noticed. He had asked. She had come. And the vampire king who had been losing himself came back, not to the man he had been before the centuries accumulated, because that man was irretrievably part of the past, and not to the institutional king that 400 years had built, because the king was never the whole truth of him. He came back to himself, to the 31-year-old who had gone to see a sea he could not name and found it more beautiful than anything he had words for, and the 400-year-old who had fought 40 years for a law that said people mattered, and every version in between, all of them his, all of them real. The thread held, and it was golden, and it was strong, and it belonged to them both. Outside, the city went on in the way that cities did, vast and complicated, and largely indifferent to the old Gothic building at its heart where extraordinary things had quietly taken root. The mourning patients were waiting. The new year was young. The blood law stood, and Seraphina Holloway went to work in the clinic she had built, in the city she loved, beside the man she had come to know completely, and she was exactly who she was, and so was he, and that was the only thread that had ever really mattered.